Julian Lombardi never tolerated the unexpected. In his view of the world, everything had to be under control. Every minute of the routine meticulously planned to ensure that nothing strayed from the path. Since he lost his wife, that need for order intensified. Pain was a chaotic element, and the only way he had found to deal with it was by eliminating any unpredictable variable. His son Leonardo was no exception to that logic. The boy had it all: a renowned school, private tutors, a promising future mapped out with precision. But there was something in his gaze, a sparkle that seemed to have dimmed over the years. Julian noticed it, but avoided thinking about it. After all, there was no time for sentimentality. Until, one afternoon, when arriving home earlier than usual, Julian encountered a scene that left him bewildered. Through the office window, he saw Leonardo in the garden, barefoot with his feet touching the damp grass, and his arms extended in the air in a fluid, almost hypnotic movement. Next to him, twirling with impressive lightness, was Isabella Ruiz, the house cook. Until that moment, he had barely registered her presence, an efficient and discreet employee, nothing more. But there, before his eyes, she and Leonardo moved as if they shared a secret, a language entirely beyond Julian's comprehension. His son was smiling, a broad, free smile, the kind he hadn't seen in years, and that deeply unsettled him. At first, Julian believed it was an insignificant joke, a fleeting moment of distraction. But as he continued watching, he realized it wasn't something casual. Leonardo followed Isabella's movements with precision, as if he had practiced them before. His body moved with a naturalness that couldn't be the result of a first encounter. Isabella guided him with firm yet gentle gestures, correcting his posture, encouraging him without saying a word. Julian felt a knot in his stomach. How long had this been happening? And more importantly, why did he know nothing about it? His first instinct was to interrupt the scene, open the door, call his son, and question him, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the way Leonardo looked at Isabella, with an admiration he had never seen before. Or maybe it was simply that, for a brief moment, Julian perceived something he would never admit aloud: envy. Not of the dance, not of the lightness, but of the connection that existed there. Something that he, even as the father, had never managed to establish with his son. Julian stepped away from the window, feeling his heart race in a way that made no sense. He tried to convince himself that his reaction was only concern for Leonardo's future. He didn't want his son to be distracted by something irrelevant, to waste time on an activity without purpose. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. The discomfort came from somewhere else. The feeling that he no longer had control over everything in the boy's life. There was a part of Leonardo he didn't know, and that realization irritated him more than he cared to admit. That night, he sat at the dinner table as usual, watching Leonardo with heightened attention. The boy seemed different. He no longer had that tense posture he used to display in front of his father, nor the excessive silence of someone afraid to say something wrong. He was more present, more alive. At one point, while Isabella served the meal, Julian noticed a brief exchange of glances between them, a discreet smile from her and a look of enthusiasm on Leonardo's face. That was enough for him to make a decision. He needed to know more about who Isabella Ruiz really was. Julian was not one to ignore what bothered him. If something seemed like a threat, however small, he would take care of it before it grew. And at that moment, Isabella Ruiz was exactly that, an unknown element beginning to exert influence over Leonardo. The next day, while working in his office, he turned on his computer and began to investigate. It wasn't long before he found information that surprised him. Isabella was not just a cook. Her name appeared in old newspaper articles, always accompanied by enthusiastic praise. Promise of the National Ballet, precocious genius of dance, the bright future of Isabella Ruiz, headlines that absurdly contrasted with the simple figure he knew. Her story, however, did not have a glorious ending. There was a sudden silence in her trajectory, an abrupt pause in the records. What happened? He continued searching until he found a small note, almost forgotten in digital archives. Isabella left the stage shortly after the death of her boyfriend, an equally talented dancer who suffered a tragic accident. After that, she simply disappeared from the artistic scene. Julian leaned back in his chair, absorbing the discovery. All of that made the situation even more bewildering. What was a woman with such a past doing in his house, teaching his son to dance? And above all, why did Leonardo seem so fascinated by it? Julian couldn't get it out of his head for the rest of the day. He tried to concentrate on work, but the image of Leonardo dancing in the garden kept returning to his mind. He had always believed he was doing what was best for his son, providing him with stability, excellent education, and a safe path to the future. But what if he had ignored something essential? What if, in the attempt to protect him from the pain and unpredictability of life, he was pruning a fundamental part of who Leonardo really was? The thought irritated him. He didn't like uncertainties, and much less questioning himself. For him, everything had to have a logical answer. At the end of the afternoon, he decided he needed to clarify the situation once and for all. He walked to the kitchen, where he found Isabella organizing the utensils with her usual calm. Without preamble, he asked, "Since when have you been teaching my son to dance?" Isabella showed no surprise. She just sighed, as if she had been expecting that moment. "Since the day he saw me practicing alone and asked if he could try," she replied. As simple as that. No elaborate justifications, no excuses. Julian remained silent for a few seconds, trying to decipher this woman who, all of a sudden, seemed far more complex than he had imagined. Julian folded his arms, studying Isabella with a penetrating gaze. He expected anything: a hesitant justification, an apology, perhaps even an attempt to convince him that this was something good for Leonardo. But she simply held his gaze, serene, as if she had nothing to hide. That irritated him even more. "And did you think it was a good idea to teach my son to dance without consulting me?" he questioned, keeping his voice controlled. Isabella did not avert her gaze. It wasn't a planned decision, but he wanted to learn. And honestly, he needed something to make him happy. Those words struck him in a strange way. Happiness. It was something Julian didn't usually consider a priority. What mattered was security, success, efficiency. Yet here was a woman whom he barely knew, telling him straight out that maybe his son needed something different. He wanted to retort, but nothing came to him. Instead, he simply took a deep breath and left the kitchen without another word. During dinner, his posture was tense, his thoughts tangled. He looked at Leonardo, trying to catch signals he had never noticed before. The way the boy avoided talking about school, as if merely fulfilling an obligation. The way his gaze always seemed distant, as if he were waiting for something that never arrived. And then, he remembered the smile in the garden, the sparkle in the eyes that he himself hadn't seen in years. Something inside him stirred, an uncomfortable feeling, as if he had made a mistake and was only now beginning to notice it. That night, Julian couldn't sleep well. He tossed and turned in bed, staring at the dark ceiling while his mind replayed the conversation with Isabella and the scene in the garden. He had never considered dance something significant. To him, it was a fleeting activity, without practical use. But then why did it unsettle him so much? Was it merely the fact of having lost control over the situation? Or was there something deeper he didn't want to admit? The thought bothered him, because it meant that perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't know what was best for Leonardo. The next morning, Julian watched his son from a distance while he ate breakfast. Leonardo seemed oblivious to his father's tension, yet he was more animated, almost enthusiastic. It was subtle, but noticeable. When Isabella entered the kitchen, the boy's eyes lit up for a brief moment, a detail Julian wouldn't have noticed before. That was enough for him to make a decision. He needed to understand better what was happening. If he wanted to maintain control, he required information. And above all, he needed to ensure that Leonardo wasn't creating unrealistic expectations about something that, in the end, might lead nowhere. Over the following days, Julian observed Leonardo more closely, without the boy noticing. What began as an impulse to control soon transformed into something more unsettling. He realized that dance wasn't just a pastime for his son. It wasn't something he did in a superficial or disinterested manner. On the contrary, Leonardo showed dedication, practiced when he thought no one was watching, and most impressively, seemed genuinely happy doing it. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a discovery. And that made Julian feel a mixture of fear and frustration. He had spent years molding Leonardo for a safe, structured path, leaving no room for uncertainties. But now, the boy seemed to have found something that didn't fit into that plan. On a quiet afternoon, Julian decided to test his own limits. He walked to the living room and grabbed the remote, turning on the television to a channel broadcasting a classical dance competition. He said nothing, just waited to see his son's reaction. Leonardo, who was on the sofa, looked up and for an instant froze. Then his expression changed. The sparkle in his eyes returned. His breathing deepened a bit. He watched every movement of the dancers with absolute concentration, as if absorbing every detail. In that moment, Julian realized that no matter what he said or did, the dance was already a part of Leonardo. He could try to ignore it, control it, divert attention, but his son had already found something that truly moved him. Julian turned off the television without a word and left the living room, but the impact of that scene stayed with him. The way Leonardo had watched the competition, completely absorbed, brought him a strange sensation, something between admiration and distrust. He had spent years believing he was preparing his son for a solid future. But what if he was just imposing his own insecurities? The idea deeply disturbed him. He had always been sure that emotions were dangerous distractions, that feelings hampered logic and efficiency. But what if he was wrong? The next day, as he walked down the hall, he heard music coming from the garden. He stopped before being seen and discreetly spied. There was Isabella, guiding Leonardo, who was trying to replicate a complex movement. The boy made mistakes, but he didn't give up. He tried again and again. Julian noticed something curious. Isabella didn't lavish excessive praise, nor did she treat Leonardo as if he were fragile. She simply taught, corrected, and allowed him to discover for himself how to improve. It was a discipline different from what Julian knew, not based on rigidity, but on genuine growth. And then, for the first time, he wondered if he wasn't underestimating his own son. That night, Julian sat in his office, staring at the computer screen, unable to concentrate on work. The images of his son dancing, tirelessly trying to get every movement right, wouldn't leave his head. He had always believed that protecting him meant preparing him for what truly mattered: a secure career, financial stability, a future without surprises. But now he saw Leonardo striving with a determination he had never shown in any of the studies, extracurricular activities chosen by his father, or private lessons that his father insisted on paying for. Sighing, Julian leaned back in his chair. It was impossible to deny. This meant something for his son, and deep down, he knew he couldn't simply tear that desire away, as if it were a passing whim. But accepting the idea that Leonardo might follow a different path than planned still seemed terrifying to him. He didn't want to see him suffer, fail, or be frustrated by dreams that might never come true. However, for the first time, a doubt arose. Was it his role to prevent his son from failing? Or was it simply to support him so that he could discover on his own where that path would lead? The answer to that question came unexpectedly a few days later, when Leonardo entered the living room with a sheet of paper in his hand. He hesitated for a moment before handing it to his father. Julian took the paper and, upon reading it, felt his heart race. It was an enrollment form for a youth dance competition. Leonardo's name was already registered. The decision made. The boy looked at him with a mix of anxiety and hope, waiting for his father's reaction. Julian didn't know what to say. Every rational part of him screamed that this was a mistake, that it made no sense to invest time and energy in something so uncertain. But, at the same time, he couldn't ignore the way his son clenched his fists, as if he were ready to defend his choice if necessary. For a moment, Julian saw himself years ago, facing the pressure from his own family to follow a traditional path in business. He remembered the weight of expectations that had never asked if he wanted to bear them. Was he doing the same with Leonardo? He took a deep breath and handed the paper back. "If you're going to do this, then you have to dedicate yourself truly," he said, trying to keep his voice firm despite the inner turmoil. Leonardo's face lit up, as if those words were all he needed to hear. Julian didn't know if he had made the right decision, but one thing was clear. For the first time, he was truly listening to his son. The days that followed were different from everything Julian had experienced with Leonardo. For the first time, he saw his son get up early of his own accord, rush to practices with Isabella, and return home exhausted, but with a sparkle in his eyes that he had never seen before. The boy was determined, and that confused him. How could something that Julian had always considered irrelevant spark so much passion? He tried not to show it, but he was torn between pride and apprehension. If Leonardo really turned out to be good, that could open doors to an unexpected future. But if he failed, Julian would have to be prepared to deal with the disappointment. On the day of the competition, Julian sat in the audience with a racing heart. He had never felt so nervous about something unrelated to work or business. When the curtains opened and Leonardo stepped onto the stage, he felt a lump in his throat. The boy seemed small under the harsh lights, but there was something in his posture that conveyed confidence. The music began, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. Leonardo danced with the same dedication he had shown during practices, but now there was something more. A genuine commitment, a connection with the moment. It wasn't just about technique. It was something that came from within. And it was there, in that performance, that Julian finally understood. Julian realized he was holding his breath. Every movement of Leonardo was precise, but not mechanized. He wasn't simply repeating steps he had learned, he was telling a story, conveying something that words could not express. Julian looked around and saw the audience equally absorbed in the performance. It was impossible to ignore. His son had talent. Not because he was perfect, but because he managed to move people emotionally. When the music ended and Leonardo stood still in the center of the stage, silence enveloped the theater for a brief moment, followed by intense applause. Julian, without realizing it, stood up along with the audience. The announcement of the winners came shortly after. Leonardo did not win first place. Julian felt a tightening in his chest when he heard another competitor's name, fearing his son's reaction. But Leonardo did not seem dejected. On the contrary, he was smiling. Then, a special award was announced: Best Artistic Expression. Leonardo's name echoed through the theater, and the boy went up on stage to receive the trophy. Julian saw Isabella smiling by his side, moved. And in that instant, he understood what really mattered. It wasn't about winning or losing, but about finding something that made one feel alive. When Leonardo came down from the stage, holding the award with a sparkle in his eyes, Julian felt an instinctive urge to go to him. For years, he had avoided overt displays of affection, believing that firmness was the best way to prepare his son for life. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. Leonardo looked at him, as if seeking confirmation, a sign that his choice had not been a mistake. Without much thought, Julian opened his arms, and before he could hesitate, his son threw himself into them. It was a brief hug, but full of meaning. For the first time in a long time, Julian didn't need to say anything. Later, as they left the theater, Leonardo held the trophy to his chest and, without looking at his father, cautiously asked, "Can I keep training?" Julian paused for a moment, contemplating the night ahead. The old Julian would have responded with a speech about priorities, about the future, about the importance of keeping one's feet on the ground. But this Julian, the one who had just seen his son shine on stage, understood that his role wasn't to control every step his son took. It was to be by his side, no matter where that path led. He sighed and smiled slightly. "You can," he replied. And, for the first time, he felt that he was finally doing the right thing. In the days that followed, Julian noticed subtle but significant changes. Leonardo was more confident, more willing to converse and share his ideas. The silent barrier between them seemed to finally dissolve. Isabella continued training the boy, and, to Julian's surprise, he no longer felt the same discomfort as before. On the contrary, he began to see Isabella differently, not as an intruder, but as someone who, unexpectedly, had helped his son find himself. One afternoon, while passing by the living room, he saw Isabella adjusting Leonardo's posture as he repeated a complicated movement. For the first time, Julian didn't feel the need to intervene. He simply stood there, watching. As he was leaving, he heard Isabella say, "Dance isn't about being perfect. It's about finding your voice." And in that moment, Julian understood that this lesson wasn't just for Leonardo, it was for him too. He had spent his life trying to avoid risks, controlling every detail to prevent pain and failure from entering. But in doing so, he had also pushed away joy and discovery. He would never know where dance might take Leonardo, but that no longer mattered. For the first time, he understood that his role wasn't to guarantee a safe destiny, but to support his son on the journey, and perhaps to learn along the way.